Ja esimesena on mul hea meel kutsuda kõnepulti Jānis Kažociņš, kes on endine Läti Põhiseaduse Kaitse Büroo juht ja täna annab nõu nii sise- kui välisministeeriumile Lätis. Olge head!
I know that I have a very short time to get through a great deal of information. And while this morning we were talking about the civilized challenges to internal security, I'm now going to talk about the uncivilized ones. And I'm afraid they're very real because I base this on three principles. One is that Putin is not going to leave the Baltic states alone. And if anybody was in any doubt, then I think the abduction of Eest and proves to us that we are very much in his sights. He warned us in writing in February of 2012 in Vedomosti that the non-citizen issue was, quote, unacceptable to Russians. So we must expect that it will be raised, and indeed the Russian speakers in our countries will be used against us as far as it's possible. Secondly, what Putin does in the Baltic states will not be the same as that which is done in Crimea or eastern Ukraine. We are, after all, members of NATO and the EU. Therefore, he will do something different. And believe me, the Russian general staff are very competent and are perfectly capable of thinking up very unpleasant, nasty things to make our lives extremely difficult. And thirdly, that means that we have got to go back to basics. And I apologize if I'm insulting anyone's intelligence, but I think it is really important to go through the principles. First of all, we talk quite a lot about what security is. It is absolutely essential, but the player who will most likely provide security can be a national player, can be a regional player, or even a community player, someone who defends the community against an unjust state. Internal security, keeping peace, upholding national law, and can use a number of different methods to do so. So what are the threats faced by Estonia? Very quickly, the nuclear threat that we've heard quite a lot about recently, Anne Applebaum in particular, that is probably an absolute bluff, but as far as our discussion this afternoon is concerned, it isn't really relevant. External military threat, in other words, Zapad 2013, NATO will take care of that, and the Estonian and Baltic armed forces. An internal military threat, little green men. NATO will help us. General Breedlove is quite clear about that, because if they are in organized military formations, that's easy. By the way, hybrid war is not something that the Russian General Staff dreamt up 2 years ago. For instance, the Second Boer War of 1899 to 1902 was a hybrid war, as indeed was Vietnam. Subversion. Now we're getting to the more difficult areas. Covert unlawful acts, destroying the system of government, unlawful ways. And then insurgency, violent means to change the government. And last, open rebellion. Now, let me illustrate what this actually means through the United Kingdom's experience. Military deaths, Bosnia-Kosovo, a period of 14 years, 72. Iraq, a period of 6 years, 179. Afghanistan, a period of 13 years, 445. It's a lot. These are all human beings. Northern Ireland, 29 years, and all the previous, if you add the time together, 33 years, in other words, a shorter period of time, every year more British military deaths were occurring in Northern Ireland than do in wars. Now that is a very important point, and if you add the thousands of deaths which are civilian, then you see that insurgency, even in a very advanced civilized country like Great Britain, is very dangerous. Why is Northern Ireland interesting? Because the majority in Northern Ireland want to stay as part of the United Kingdom. An ethnically different minority wanted to join the Irish Republic and split from the United Kingdom, and a massively minor part of those were prepared to use military force to try to achieve this objective. Does that remind you of any countries close by to here? Sir Robert Thomson gave his 5 principles of counterinsurgency as a solution for the problems in Malaya. I will go through them very, very quickly because we don't have time. Clear political aims, in accordance with the law, must have an overall plan, absolutely essential. Political solution is more important than the military solution, and securing base areas. What can be relevant to Estonia now? Minimum force is something we need to be aware of, and that's why this ministry is the lead ministry, even when we get into those sort of circumstances, not the Ministry of Defence. Unified command structures and executive committees, yes, the three-legged stool of civil government, police and military, but we talked about local government, we talked about NGOs, we talked about all kinds of other organizations which need to be brought in, and this in due course will have an intelligence import of its own as well. Intelligence-based operations. Intelligence is at the forefront, and that is why in counterinsurgency usually the targeted assassination of intelligence officials and sources is one of the things which is quite typical. And PSYOPs and InfoOps. And here we're getting into information. You've got to have the population on your side, otherwise you will not win. And therefore the government needs to be doing anything as long as it doesn't harm. And so we are getting to the point where populations can make their own choices. And remember that a population would prefer to have their own, and in our case that might not be us, governing their part of a particular city, for instance, rather than outsiders. That can be different because we see in eastern Ukraine anything as long as the shooting stops. But what we're getting to here is information war. And ladies and gentlemen, Putin is winning the information war because the West has not caught up. We have not yet understood that Russia manipulates with the objectivity of Western media and infiltrates it in that way, but does not give us the opportunity to do the same for their target audiences. And that's why perception is so important. That's why we see that there are so many Russenversteher, people who understand that the West is responsible for what Russia is doing because we provoked Russia in some tremendous way. And of course, Kiev is full of fascists. And that's a message which is going down very quickly and very fast. So the questions: what does the government need to know and prepare? How will it receive it? Well, we heard already through the services. Who will be responsible? Which ministries, and how will they coordinate their work? We've heard a lot about that already. Which other agencies are involved? And here they could be NGOs, they could be neighborhood watch, they could be all sorts. And how will they transition? What is the point at which, for instance, the situation has got so serious that the Ministry of Interior asks the Ministry of Defense to take over the role of leadership? And that is something that has to be played out, otherwise when the time comes, we won't be ready. So we get to intelligence. This is obvious what it means. What is the purpose of intelligence? It is to get to those who make decisions on our behalf, the information to enable them to make the best possible decisions on behalf of Estonia or their own country. That means leaders have got to be involved. They've got to know what they want to, what their needs are, and it also means involvement at every level. And if you have this sort of executive committee, the sort of thing we were talking about this morning of cooperation on a local level, you will get excellent intelligence, providing a means can be found to harvest what is already there and get it as intelligence to those who need them. And that is why we have an intelligence cycle. This is the classic intelligence cycle, and it is questioned by intelligence professionals. But note that planning is important. Collection, plan, processing, exploitation, that is added value, analysis, added value, dissemination, and feedback. There are difficulties with the intelligence cycle, but just be aware that that's how it is, and I have to run quickly on. Sources, the most important human intelligence for us, open sources, cyber sources, SIGINT, and FININT. Do not forget financial intelligence. That is one of the ways in which the professional IRA back was broken. Sources are rated from A to F. I won't go into this because I'm afraid we don't have time, but if you come across intelligence, it's worth knowing. Likewise, content ratings from 1 to 6, confirmed or cannot be judged. There are other ways, but this is a very useful way. Current intelligence, what it gives us, all sources need to be together, and I'm running through this because we're running out of time. Checklists. What really would worry us most? Well, what about a Zarpad 16 and at the same time an artificially created a Russian minority problem in Estonia or in Narva, for instance? What is the center of gravity? What is our center of gravity that will make us fail? What is the opposition's center of gravity? Don't make too many assumptions. And likewise, don't believe everything that is published, but listen to what Putin says. Have a red team, play it out. Eastern Ukraine, I'll now go into more specifics. The aim is so that Ukraine as a whole doesn't become a member of NATO, European Union. The reset was a disaster for the West because the Kremlin believes the West is essentially weak and unable to stand up to it. And there was nobody 6 months ago in Moscow who believed for a moment that Western sanctions would last more than 6 months. Remember that Ukraine is premature. The attack against Ukraine was made when the Russian armed forces were not yet battle ready, and so we have all the stuff which is really good there or on the border, and the 90% cannon fodder is elsewhere. But that doesn't mean it couldn't be used here given the right circumstances. But then we have NATO. They will use proxies, we know that, local discontent, and there are signs, certainly in Latvia, and I expect here as well, intelligence. We'll be feeling a totally different kind of pressure, which you could call a hot peace. Putin himself, he has fostered unpredictability, pretended that he might just be mad enough to launch a nuclear attack on Warsaw. Hardly likely. His main aim is to keep in power as long as possible, because he believes when he's out of power, he'll be dead. He's concerned about his legacy and sees Russia genuinely now as having a great historic mission. He's banished the people from his inner circle who were giving objective advice and criticizing his policies. And therefore, finally winding up, don't expect to see here or in Latvia or Lithuania what we've seen elsewhere. They will be different things. And therefore, intelligence is the key to spotting it in time. As your president said, I am preparing for war. Civis pacem para bellum. That means strengthen NATO, do what we need for NATO, strengthen self-defense, and social integration is almost as important here, certainly as in Latvia, as NATO membership itself. Cross-government, local authority cooperation, I've mentioned already a couple of times, and intelligence, getting involved from the top down and from the bottom up. And I'm only 40 seconds over.
Oh, thank you. Very disciplined. And as planned, now we have 5 minutes for questions and answers as well. Does anyone have any questions? Kas kellelgi on küsimusi?
All the questions answered. Wonderful.
Do we have any other threats than Mr. Putin?
We have a whole range of threats, and of course it is wrong to look at those sort of internal security threats alone, because your ICDS, the International Centre for Defence Studies, recently did had a seminar outside Tallinn to look at different scenarios. One was a Northern Ireland type scenario, and another was the failed Estonia scenario, where the government is unable to control the country. And there are ways to achieve this, indeed through cyber attack, through physical attack, through destruction, and through propaganda. It is, again, the perception, the information warfare. This is all extremely important, and this can tie in with all kinds of other ways in which those who do not want to see Estonia and the Baltic states prosper will undoubtedly try to test us.
You said that it's very much up to the political elite who needs this information. How do you see, you are an advisor to a government. Do they take your advice? How do you see this scene?
In part.
Is it important part or the unimportant part?
There are two ways, and we will have a much longer discussion with intelligence professionals at 4 o'clock about this. But there is the push-pull. It is rather like logistics, which I'm sure people in the commercial world understand very well. Either you push forward with your product and hope that it'll be accepted, or you wait for the need for the product and then you produce it, or indeed you have a just-in-time system like the big supermarkets. Well, often where you ought to have a pull, that is, I am a senior minister and I know what I ought to be aware of in order to fulfill my role, and therefore I ask my services to give me this information. But frequently there are millions of other local issues which have to be dealt with immediately, and they're not focusing on the middle distance, and therefore you end up with a position where the intelligence services are pushing information forward, and sometimes it's not very welcome. For instance, in the case of a number of our European partners, over recent years, the intelligence services have understood extremely well, thanks to the work of Estonian and other intelligence services, what is going on in the Kremlin and what we can expect from Russian foreign policy. But that is not the message they wanted to hear. I won't name any names, but you can guess what sort of countries I'm talking about. The political elite did not want to hear these messages, and the best that these services can do is to provide detailed information so that when the time comes, when the issue is on the political agenda, as indeed it is now, or is raised by our senior political figures, then those back in those countries turn to their own services and say, hey, what do you know about this? Is this true? And they can produce wads of good intelligence, confirmed intelligence, which says, yes, it is, and here are the examples. And that is another way, and this is the push-pull again.
You said that most probably it's going to be different than it was and still is in Ukraine. What piece of information would make you extremely nervous towards Estonia or Latvia?
That's a very interesting question. There is a line of thought which suggests that there may come a time when we will look back on the Putin times as the good times, because we more or less knew where we stood. Because if Putin goes, then we don't know what will come in his place. We saw in Ukraine that Yanukovych was cast out by a Ukrainian population who Putin in September, on the 20th of September of last year at Valdai, had described as part of the same nation. The Ukrainians, he said, and the Russians are one nation but two states. They belong together. It's not just an economic matter. And if one part of the nation can kick out a corrupt dictator, then it doesn't take the logic of a professor of philosophy to understand that the other part of the nation might start thinking along those lines. And even worse than that, if in Ukraine or in the power vertical up to now, everyone has thought, when Putin goes, we're all going to be hanging from the lampposts. But that didn't happen in Ukraine. Yanukovych was kicked out, but all the old politicians, more or less, still stayed there, still doing their corrupt business, which of course is such a huge challenge for Ukraine now, which is why Poroshenko so badly needs the parliamentary elections. And that might mean in Moscow, those who are watching to think, well, maybe there is political life after Putin after all. And that makes Putin even more determined to have to act in order to preserve himself. He had to act after Yanukovych was kicked out. Otherwise, he would have been seen as weak, and then that would have been the end of him politically.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.